Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Elhamdülillah. Vessalatu vesselamu ala Resulillah. Our guest today is an acclaimed cultural historian, Richard Foltz. He's expert in Iran and in broader Iranian world, and he has over 10 books, I guess 11, 12 books now. Every year he's writing new books. 12 books, and recent books by Richard Foltz were the history of Tajiks and also Iranian work history, translated by myself. He has a PhD degree from Harvard University, Middle Eastern history. He also has a degree from University of Utah, Persian literature and applied linguistics. So he's today with us, joining us. He's right now working in Montreal, Canada, in Concordia University. He's Canadian, but of American origin. He's with us today. Thank you so much. Welcome to ILEM Talks, the 9th ILEM Talks, the first face-to-face after pandemic pause. So we are very excited, and it's an exciting moment for me as well, because I'm one of the oldest students of ILEM. Just 20 years ago, we were the first students with the chairman, Abdülkadir Majid, who is my classmate as well. And it's a very exciting moment for me to be here. Without further ado, we can start. There is a verse in Quran, in Surah Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلًا لِتَعَارَفُوا. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we made you into nations and tribes so that you can know each other. The word sha, shu'ub, has both meanings, nation and separation. And also this word has a meaning, a union and also disunion. So originally this word from schools, the bonds of schools, the connections and disconnections points of the schools. So here we have the word, this word. Another saying, Turkish saying, we have used in presentations, başsız börk olmaz, Tatsız Türk bolmas. A hat won't be without a hat, and a Turk wouldn't be without a Persian or Tajik. Now, here is the first question. Very briefly, who are the Turks and Persians? And Iranians and Turks in history are seen back and forth between East and West, and it's not easy for us to trace who are they, because we just describe them by language right now. And how would you describe in historical union and disunion points of Turks and Iranians? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Teşekkür ederim. I'm very pleased to be here, have the opportunity to meet and speak with you. I'd like to thank the organizers for this invitation, and also for the honor of being your first in-person speaker after the pandemic. And I'm especially happy that Dr. Gökalp is able to be here as well. It's sure thanks to him that I'm here. In part, it was because, well, I'm here doing research in Turkey, a research project on Ossetian migrants, or the descendants of migrants from the 1860s who came from the Caucasus. And I found that there are 3 villages in Anatolia and Yozgat district where they still speak Ossetian. I thought this is unbelievable, so amazing. After 160 years, they still kept their language. So that's I'm here doing this research, but the reason I came to, or the motivation to come to Turkey was Hüseyin translated one of my books. It was published in Istanbul in January. So it seemed like a good opportunity, a good time to come to Turkey. So, you know, things coming together very nicely. I told the organizers I'm happy to talk about any topic related to Iranian culture, Iranian history. They suggested the relationship between Iranians and Turks. And I thought, okay, good topic. I've written about it in several books. It's a difficult topic, a lot of problems. First problem is that we moderns living in the 21st century, we have certain ways of making frameworks for our thinking. And many of these frameworks are the product of developments in modern history and modern societies. So we're affected by this. And if we try to study history, we can make the mistake of projecting modern frameworks onto the past in ways that can be inappropriate, and they can lead us to draw wrong conclusions, make wrong interpretations of the past. And we can see that 20th century was famous for nationalist movements that often resulted in horrible violence. You know, we had world wars, we had many countries separate, have civil wars, and what's called intercommunal violence. So, you know, whether we talk about, you know, the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and the violence that came with that, or the independence of India from Great Britain and the violence that, you know, we're used to calling it intercommunal violence. So it can be because it can be blamed on religion, or it can be blamed on language or some other aspect of cultural identity, which assumes that people have separate identities and are going to be in conflict because their separate identities give them competing claims, not just claims over land and resources, but also claims about history. You know, it's our history. No, this is our history, you know. And we can see that even claims about history can cause bloodshed, can cause fighting and killing. So I think it's really, it's necessary to look at history and try to understand how people understood identity, because it can be a corrective. It can help correct many of the problems that we have today, which are connected with identity. Now, one of the most important features of the modern way of conceptualizing ethnic identity is language. So if you speak a certain language, it means you belong to a certain culture, and you can claim a certain history, and there's all kinds of ramifications of that. Language, very, very important. But the problem is that this is really a modern way of defining an ethnic group by language. And it comes, I think, mostly out of some political philosophers of the Enlightenment period in France and elsewhere in Europe. In other words, 18th century. In other words, modern. In other words, very recent. This way of conceptualizing the identity of the nation. And the theory that the proper form of a state is to base it on a nation. Nation-state theory. So I just want to make 2 points.
first is that it's just a theory. It's not a fact. Okay? It's a theory which makes a claim that the correct basis for a state is the nation. And because it's a theory that is not a proven fact, you can also argue against it. You can say no, that the nation is not the proper basis for a state. That's the first point I want to make, is that we, as moderns, we tend to accept nation-state theory as a fact, as a reality. We can't fight it, you know? But history tells us it's not true. History tells us that this is a way of thinking which came about at a particular time in a particular place, 18th century France. Okay? So for the rest of history, it doesn't necessarily apply. Other examples from history, other time periods, other places, they give us different examples. And a very obvious one in our context here in Istanbul is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was not a nation state. It was a multinational state. It was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious state. And for at least 400 years, it functioned very well. Maybe the last 100 years, not so much. But for the first 400 years, the Ottoman Empire functioned very well and gives us a good historical counterexample against this nation-state theory, which only dates back to the late 18th century. So this is kind of a long preface to get back to the title of the talk, Turks and Iranians, the relationship between Turks and Iranians, because we have to, in order to discuss that question, we have to first talk about what we mean by Turks and what we mean by Iranians. Because the way these words are used today in the modern world is based primarily on language. If you speak Turkish, you're a Turk. If you speak Persian, you're an Iranian. Okay? That's the way most people understand these words. And we cannot have this discussion about the historical relationship between Turks and Iranians unless we get rid of that modern idea that it's just language. It's not just language. And in fact, language, it's fairly, I would say, low on the list of features that define the two identities that we want to talk about. Now, I use the word symbiosis in the title. Symbiosis, I'm not sure if the meaning of the term is clear to you. Our colleague we were speaking with a few minutes ago, who's not here now, kept using the word fusion. Fusion is not the same thing as symbiosis. Fusion is when two things come together and become one so that you cannot see the separation anymore. That's not symbiosis. Symbiosis is two things which are different. They come together to form a unity, but they're still different. It's a unity made up of two different things. Okay? So you can say like yin and yang, you know, in the Chinese Taoist cosmology. You know, there's still, if you look at the drawing, you know, of the yin and the yang, you can see, well, they're still separate. They're forming one whole, but half of it is white, half of it is black, you know, and there's a clear line separating them. So that's what we mean by symbiosis. In a symbiosis, you cannot have one without the other. They require each other. Okay? They need each other to make the whole. If you take one away, then you don't have the whole anymore. But there's still two different things. Now, when we talk about the history of Eurasia, going back at least 3,000 years, there's an interesting historical reality that you can see spread all across Eurasia, which we can associate with the concept of the Silk Road, which also is a problematic term because it's a modern invention. There's no such thing as the Silk Road in history, but again, it's an idea, it's a framework that was invented in the late 19th century to help us conceptualize a part of the world and certain historical phenomena that were going on. Intercultural exchange across Eurasia, both trade, commerce, goods, but also ideas and culture were being exchanged along these networks, which were basically land routes that connected oasis market centers all the way from here, you know, from the Mediterranean all the way to China over the course of, well, people talk about the Silk Road saying it was opened in 139 BCE. I think that's arbitrary nonsense because these connections were going on more than 3,000 years ago. We have archaeological and linguistic evidence that there were Western peoples interacting with the Chinese in China more than 3,000 years ago. So this, you know, these cultural connections, they go back a very long time. And the reason that what we call the Silk Road, I think, came into existence are geographical, because if you look at a physical map of Eurasia, you will see there are mountains all the way across from, you know, the Balkans and the Carpathians, all, you know, across the Alborz Mountains and into the Tian Shan in Central Asia, all the way to Mongolia and China. You have mountain ranges, and then you have the steppe which goes from Hungary to Mongolia and even to Manchuria, steppe zone. So you have this ecological reality. Now in the past, when people traveled, they didn't have maps. They needed to go where there was water and where there was grass for their animals. So, you know, they were naturally going to follow this line of ecological transition, mountains meeting steppe. You don't know where you're going, but you're not going to go into the mountains because it's difficult and dangerous. So you'll stay on the steppe, but close to the mountains so that you get the water running off. And so it's very easy to understand why human movement followed this line, which eventually became the Silk Road. Everybody clear with that so far? Okay, the other thing that happened was that about maybe 5,500 years ago, some of the peoples living on the steppes domesticated the horse. Okay, they already, before that, they had domestic cattle, they had domestic sheep, they had domestic goats, but at a certain point, they domesticated the horse, and that was the biggest revolution in transportation technology in human history until the 19th century, in the invention of the railroad. Okay, so the domestication of the horse enabled people to move across the Eurasian steppe, right, and create these contacts between China and the Mediterranean and all the peoples in between. Okay, so the ecological necessity of following a path where you have mountains and steppe, and the domestication of the horse. So who were these peoples that lived on the steppe? They didn't have writing, you know, they didn't leave us books or anything, they left us no documents. So it's really impossible to say for sure what was their ethnicity. And in fact, I think that arguments over the ethnicity of the steppe peoples are pointless because, in my opinion, these steppe nomads included many different ethnicities, many different language groups, many different racial groups, and we see this in the Soviet period especially. Soviet archaeologists they did a lot of work across Eurasia, and they dug up skeletons, and they did DNA tests, and they did cranial studies, and they're trying to determine the races of all these people. But we see that for thousands of years they were mixing. And if they were mixing racially, then we can assume they were also mixing linguistically and to an extent culturally. So in my opinion, to say, oh, they were this race or they spoke this language or whatever, it's a pointless argument. What we can talk about is dominant features, dominant racial characteristics. You know, in the mix of DNA, you might have, you know, certain genes that are more dominant, others that you see less. In language, there might have, likely, there would have been prestige languages that were used by the group in power, but, you know, other languages spoken by other tribes that were associated with them. Cultural elements as well. And a good example here would be the Mongols. We talk about the Mongols, and you know, the Mongols are famous for building the biggest empire in the history of the world. And, you know, they had this huge army of hundreds of thousands of horsemen, you know, who were great fighters and everything. But it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the majority of the Mongols were not Mongols. They didn't speak Mongolian, you know. They were not ethnically, racially Mongol. The leaders, the elites, were Mongols, and therefore we project this identity onto the whole mass movement. Probably most of the people who were fighting as Mongols, probably they were Turkic speakers, but they were probably also Iranian speakers and, you know, speakers of other languages as well. And this is a good example, I think, of how we can misunderstand history when we just project ideas. You know, the Mongols. So, okay, there's hundreds of thousands of Mongols. Well, it's a complex issue. We can't just reduce this Mongol identity to one language and one race and then say that, you know, that's what we're talking about when we talk about Mongol history. Okay, that's just one example. There are so many examples we could take. And because one of the characteristics of steppe nomads is that they almost never had any kind of central authority. Okay, Chinggis Khan, or to go back earlier, you know, the Khagan of the Gök Turks, or later on Timur. These were the exceptions. You know, individual men who had enough charisma that they could bring together a large confederation of tribes. But I wouldn't even call the result a state, because these confederations, they didn't last long. You know, within a few decades, they're gone. Because this is the nature of tribal nomadic society, is that they don't build civic institutions, they don't build cities, they don't build governments, you know, they don't, it's very fluid. It's always in flux. It's a constant interactions, okay? It's like water flowing in channels, you know? You might get different channels of water and they join together and they form a huge river, you know, for a few kilometers. And then a little further on, they might split into other channels again. Okay, so if you just look at that few kilometers where it's a huge river, well, it's not the whole reality. And it's a reality that's changing all the time because the water's coming from behind and it's then going, you know, beyond. So this is another point I want to make about how we can misunderstand history. We try to make our frameworks, you know, too concrete, and we're going to miss a lot. We don't just want to focus on one thing or one aspect. So basically what we see for the last 3,000 years, little more perhaps, if we look at Central Eurasia, which is the origin of the peoples that we call Turks today, and also the origin of the people that we call Iranians today. If you go further back, I think Turkic speakers came from further east and Iranian speakers from further west. But, you know, at a certain point, they started to, you know, converge and interact. And that's the beginning of this symbiosis that I'm trying to point out in the title of the talk. So what is...
When approximately?
I would say, well, if you look at cultural artifacts from archaeology, material culture, maybe going back more than 3,000 years. If you look at DNA, about 2,500 years ago in the region of Altai Mountains in Central Asia, southern Siberia, you can see that there are what are called, you know, Mongolian types and Caucasoid types, you know. So, you know, basically you could say East Asian and European physical features that we see in skeletons or the DNA, that they're starting to mix by around 2,500 years ago in the Altai region. And again, you can guess that the Mongoloid features might be associated with people who spoke Proto-Turkic language. And you can guess that the Caucasoid featured elements, they were maybe speaking Iranian language. These are guesses, you know, and I mean, and you can contest them, but you should have evidence. There's some of the evidence we can get, for example, in topography, place names, toponyms, okay? And we see that across Eurasia, if we look at toponyms, we can see that there seems to be a movement of Proto-Turkic toponyms moving from east to west, and Iranian toponyms moving from west to east. And again, they converge. So that's some evidence. Again, it doesn't prove anything absolutely, but you bring together, you know, different kinds of evidence and you start to form a general picture. So we have language. It's really difficult to know. Again, toponyms are one example. We have, by 3,000 years or so ago, we start to have mentions of steppe nomads in written sources. You know, for example, from Mesopotamia, from China, and with a few hundred years later from Iran, by the 6th century or so, from Iran, you have mentions of the steppe peoples. So we get people's names. And names can be an indication of the language that people speak. It's pretty good evidence. It's not absolute evidence, okay? I mean, your name is Hüseyin, it's an Arabic name, you're not an Arab, you know? So the name that you have isn't a guarantee of your language and ethnicity, but if you see on a broad scale, it can be some evidence, it can be a sign. And again, you have to combine it with other things. So names of, you know, important people, toponyms, names of places. Also, you can look at comparative mythology. So, for example, and I don't know that much about Turkic mythology. You know, I read Dede Korkut, you know, but I'm not an expert. Iranian mythology, I know much better, both from sources like the Shahnameh and also the Avesta, the sacred book of the Zoroastrians, preserves some material going back more than 3,000 years. And we have some information in these texts that can be connected to some geographical regions. That can help us trace the movements of the early Iranian speakers. I feel I can trace the movements of Iranian speakers back about 4,000 years. For me, Iranian identity starts to become clear between 2200 BCE and 1800 BCE, so around 4,000 years ago, in the region of the southern Ural Mountains, what's now Western Siberia. We have an archaeological complex that the Soviets called the Sintashta Archaim complex. We have towns and a lot of material culture from there that I believe can be clearly associated with early Iranians. I believe they spoke an Iranian language, and they had elements of what we see in later Iranian culture, and also in India, because it's confirmed in the Rig Veda, the oldest Sanskrit sources. So I cannot say as much about the origins of Turks. I don't have the expertise. But I do believe that, that the ancestors, cultural and linguistic ancestors of Turks came from further east, probably northern Mongolia or, you know, the eastern Siberia, and moved westwards. The Iranians, I'm very confident, originated in western Siberia and began to move east. So again, we have a point of convergence. Beginning, I would say, no later than 3,000 years ago, we have probably Proto-Iranian speakers and Proto-Turkic speakers are coming into contact and interacting with each other. Okay? Now, at that time, by that time, I think that speakers of Proto-Iranian and speakers of Proto-Turkic had very similar culture, because culture is, I believe, to a large extent determined by your environment. Okay, so they were nomads. They lived on the steppes. In other words, they survived by keeping domestic animals. So they needed to move around to places where they could find pasture for their animals. And because this was a precarious existence and also an extreme climate, very hot summers, could be very hot, dry, very cold winters. And they could have a bad year where all the animals died. And in any case, they were living a very marginal existence. And they needed to supplement their pastoralism with raiding. So we see that these are raiding societies. And we might call this stealing, but that's, again, a modern conception. Because in the context of the times, and of course we can say the same thing about the pre-Islamic Arabs, because they had a very similar social economy to what we see in Central Asia. Raiding was an essential component of life. You had to raid to survive, and you raided people that you didn't have any obligations to, other tribes. So this is what gives rise to these confederations, because if a weaker tribe cannot protect itself from raids, it needs to ask for the protection of a stronger tribe, right, so that they can survive. And so we have these constant building of confederations, right? And, but you know, confederations, they're organic. They grow and then they shrink. They grow and they shrink, you know. And what we see about nomads is that they come together opportunistically, usually for a purpose, usually for a raid, and then afterwards they go their separate ways. And this is why the empires of the steppes are always short-lived, you know. They come together because there's a united purpose, but then, okay, it's like we've achieved our purpose and now we want ours, you have yours, and we have this centrifugal force which leads to the disintegration of these empires. So it's like growing and then, you know.
Excuse me, we have around 10 minutes left.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, we understood Iranians and Turks have a very long history, going back to thousands of years.
Yeah.
Also, we have an understanding that in modern concept, to create a nation, to build a nation, to structure a nation, we need a language,
right.
We need a territory, we need maybe political entity or union, etc. But here a question, just I will come to today. There are some, oddly enough, there are some nations, there are some people of Iranian origin claiming to be non-Iranian, and also there are some nations of Turkic origin claiming not to be Turkish. So, for Uzbekistan and Tajikistan are two examples for it, and you know those both countries very well. You have books as well. you know, they are speaking Persian, for example, Tajiks, and Uzbeks speaking a Turkic origin language, and ethnically, they are very similar.
They're the same.
People,
They're
people.
genetically, culturally the same. The only thing that's different between Uzbeks and Tajiks is the language, and it only dates to the 1920s because they were forced into this separate identity, these constructed identities invented by the Soviets. But since we only have 10 minutes, I'm going to try to get to my point and wrap up my central theme.
So it's not enough to have a language or territory from its within.
I'm going to say...
Without, you need maybe differentiation from other nations, but how they achieve this?
What I'm going to say, so my basic point, I mean, the Soviet example is an extreme one because these are invented identities. All the Soviet and post-Soviet identities were invented in the 1920s and then imposed on people by force. Okay, so it's not the natural state of things for these societies. So let me just backpedal, and I'll go back about 1,500 years to the pre-Islamic Central Asia and the period of the Silk Road, which is dominated by the Sogdians, who are the ancestors of the Uzbeks and Tajiks, who spoke an East Iranian language, not Persian, but a related East Iranian language. And they were the masters of the Silk Road. All the way from the Black Sea to China, they had colonies, but they didn't have a government. They didn't have a state. There was no Sogdian state. How did these merchants manage to dominate, you know, the trade all the way from Europe to Asia, all the way across Asia, this group without a state? It's because they had the support of Turkic tribes. Turkic tribes who would defend them, okay? Whether it's against the Romans, whether it's against the Persians, whether it's against the Chinese, they had Turkic tribes defending them. And so they had this symbiotic relationship, okay? The Turkic tribes, they benefited from their relationship with the Sogdians by receiving manufactured goods, luxury items, wine, all of the things that they could not produce in the steppe as nomads, okay? They received all these things from the Sogdians. The Sogdians, in turn, received protection. And this relationship came through negotiations, okay? So we have, for example, a quotation from a book that was written during the Tang period, in Tang, China, when one of the great empires of China, there was an advisor to the emperor who was writing, you know, about foreign policy, how the Chinese should deal with the steppe nomads. And it says in this book, well, these steppe nomads, who he calls Turks, they're you know, fairly simple, and normally it would be easy to deal with them. However, there are many Sogdians that live amongst them, and they manipulate them, and they tell them what to do, and they cause problems for us. So we can see that from the point of view of the Tang Chinese, they saw very clearly that this reciprocal and symbiotic relationship between the Iranian Sogdians and the Turkic nomads, you know, that they needed each other and they formed a unity. The Chinese had to deal with these Central Asians as a unity, but it was a unity made up of two completely different cultures. The nomadic culture of the Turkic speakers and the settled urban culture of the oasis-dwelling Sogdians who lived off of business, who lived off of trade. Okay? And this continues through the Islamic period and right up through the 19th century. So we have, by the 10th century at the latest, we have in literature, we have this phrasing of Turk and Tajik. Tajik means, as you quoted the proverb from Mahmud Kashgari, the Divan Logat al-Turk, where he says, you won't find a Turk without a Tajik, just like you won't find a hat without a head. Okay, like they go together, they need each other. But a hat and a head are not the same thing, right? You can easily tell which is the hat and which is the head. But they're useless without each other. That's the point of the proverb, right? And this continues to be a conception. But the point I want to make is that nowadays, everything gets projected back onto history based on modern definitions of identity. Oh, a Tajik is a Persian speaker from Central Asia. Oh, a Turk is a Turkish speaker, you know? But as I just mentioned, in Uzbekistan, Uzbeks and Tajiks, there's no difference between them. Not their DNA, not their culture, nothing except the language, which they were forced to learn separately starting in the 1920s. Other than that, it's the same people. So you cannot say in the Central Asian context that the notion of Turk and Tajik is about language. It's about culture. It's about, it's a sociological distinction, not a linguistic distinction. You have what some anthropologists call the steppe and the sown. You know, the steppe, the nomads, and the sown, the agricultural lands which feed the urban oases that are market centers. Two different cultures, okay, the nomadic culture and the urban settled culture. But they need each other. The urban culture cannot survive without the nomadic culture. The nomadic culture cannot survive without the urban culture. Turk and Tajik, for about 1,000 years, this phrasing of Turk and Tajik, it didn't mean language. It was a sociological concept describing this reciprocal relationship between two different kinds of societies that were mutually interdependent. Okay, so that's...
If you frame just, Turkic tribes as nomads and Iranian tribes are settled societies, is it not a misunderstanding as well for the audiences? Because we are picking up a certain time in the history, right? I mean,
we have to define. I said for 1,000 years, from the 10th century to the 19th century, this is what the term Turk and Tajik meant.
Yeah.
It referred, language, yeah, it also meant that the urban speakers tended to speak Persian and the steppe nomads tended to speak Turkish. But the reality was that they were mostly bilingual. Mm-hmm. Most native Turkish speakers could speak some degree of Persian. Most of Persian speakers could speak some degree of Turkish. And this only ended in the 1920s when, according to Soviet policy, these national identities were constructed. So yes, that's an important point. We have to define the context. Because before that, I would say before before the Sogdian period, many of the nomadic groups were Iranian speaking. Yeah. So, being a nomad didn't mean that you spoke Turkish. You could have spoken a number of different languages. But by the 10th century, in people's minds, the association was that. But what's interesting is that people we would call Turks, for example, the Timurids in the 15th century, in Timurid literature. Well, first of all, Timurids, we would say ethnically they were Turks. Their genealogy was Turkic tribes. They spoke Turkish as first language, but they used Persian as their, the language of culture and administration, and they behaved like Iranians in their food, their dress, their tastes in music, their poetry, everything. They would use the word Turk to mean not somebody who spoke Turkish, because they spoke Turkish too. Turk meant somebody who is from the steppes and doesn't know proper culture, doesn't know how to behave in a civilized environment. So it was kind of an insult, So again, to us it seems ironic, but you're a Turk, Why are you using it as an insult? But at the same time, it's an ambivalent relationship, because in the 17th century we have, for example, Emperor Jahangir Padshah in India, most powerful man on earth at the time. And he wrote in Persian, and he wrote his memoirs. But in his Persian memoirs, he has a sentence, "Do not think that I am ignorant of Turkish." Means that even after 200 years, of his dynasty, being very Persianized, but it was still symbolically important for him to associate himself with a Turkish identity. Say, don't think that I'm ignorant of Turkish. Means, yeah, I'm writing in Persian, but I know Turkish. Don't worry, And the other thing, the Moguls, they love to have important ceremonies out of the city. They would pitch tents and they would, kind of go glamping, we would say in English now, this expensive kind of camping. So they wanted to sort of symbolically acknowledge their steppe nomadic origins, although by that time they're living in these huge palaces in these, big cities. But they'd go out, into the countryside and they'd pitch these huge tents, with gold embroidery and, lots of, very luxurious tents. But again, it was a symbol that they wanted to keep a psychological connection to their steppe origins. So again,
we have talked about the cooperation so far, and also we see there's competition between Iranians and Turkish nations in history. For example, Iranian says Isfahan Nesfe Jahan, and Tabriz replies Eğer Tabriz ne başet. And Istanbul says İstanbul heme Jahan Eğer set Isfahan başet. I mean, Isfahan is half of the world, and Tabriz says if there was not, if Tabriz had not been, yes, true, Isfahan is the half of the world, but Istanbul says Istanbul is the whole of the world, even though there is hundreds of Isfahans. It's just a saying, but there is competition. Between 11th century to up to 19th century, the Turkish dynasties, Turkish houses ruled over the Iranians politically. Even though right now in Iran, the head of the rehber is Turkish. So, how do you see that competition? Is there a rivalry competition?
I don't think it's a rivalry between what Iranians as we conceive Iranians and Turks as we conceive Turks. Again, prior to the 19th century, the rivalry between Turk and Tajik was a rivalry between the urbanized, literate populations and the rustic, nomadic populations, right? They look down on each other. I mean, there's an old Turkic proverb, tat iksa, which has a double meaning in 11th century Turkish. At least it means that the Turk who goes to the city becomes a Tajik, becomes an Iranian. But it also means the sword that goes to the city gets rusted. So the sword is no good anymore. And this is reflecting the idea that, well, for the steppe nomads, they look down on the city dwellers. Oh, they're weak, they're lazy, they can't fight, they can't survive on their own, So it was, that was the rivalry. But it wasn't based on language, because the elites in these urban areas, many of them were of Turkic origin, right? So again, the rivalry was between different kinds of societies, not specifically different language-based, ethnic groups the way we see it today. And incidentally, Tabriz and Isfahan were both Safavid capitals, So I think, again, it gets back to my original point. It's really difficult to understand history properly unless we try to get rid of our modern frameworks, which may not be the appropriate lenses to view history through.
My last question, we have run out of our time. For example, Europeans or Americans, European origin, they are mainly losers. They travel to a new land, right, to find a place to live. And they
At least we're not criminals like the Australians.
Yeah. And they are like future-looking people.
Yes.
They are looking future.
Yeah, because they have no past.
They have no past. And when we look to Iranians, even to Turkish people, we are very proud of our history. It's going back to thousands of years, and because if you are, despair about today, and it's very comfortable to live in the past because we had great days, we had great empires, etc. On the other hand, Ottoman Empire. This is another thing. Ottoman Empire is west-forward, west-looking approach politically. culturally. You know, they fight against Europe, but Safavids, they had stuck there, and they maybe their main enemy was Ottoman Empire. But for Ottomans, the Iranians was not the main primary rival for them. They had different others with capital O. So for Iranians, maybe the other was the Ottomans. I don't know. Just I'm asking. Those also understandings are misleading us to understand our identities and national identities. You know, going back to history and going to the west or east. You know, stuck between west and the east. And I guess it's different for Iranians and Turkish people because we have different experiences historically. How do you comment on the Iranians, way of thinking? And
you're talking about modern Iranians and modern Turks.
Iranians,
20th, 21st century.
Correct. Yeah.
Because you have the same history, in my opinion. You know, prior to the 20th century, it's the same history. It's a united history. I mean, the Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal world was one world under 3 different governments, but they basically all ran their societies the same way. And the proof of this is that we were talking about earlier downstairs, is that people with skills, whether they were scholars or whether they were craftsmen or artists, musicians, whatever, they could move easily between these 3 empires because it was the same structure. You know, it was the same as a society structured in the same way. You know, these were all it was a shared culture. So I would not say that, you know, for the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, they considered each other the other with a capital O. Maybe for the Ottomans, Franks, you know, the Europeans were the other with a capital O. For the Mughals, it would have been non-Muslim Indians. Native Indians would have been the other. And that's very pronounced in the Muslim literature of South Asia. It's like the non-Muslims who live here, who are the majority, they're the big capital O other. You can see it in Ibn Battuta, for example. I would say that for the Safavids, the other was west. It was the west. It was Europeans and Russians were the other for the Safavids. The Ottomans were definitely not the other. They were like rival brothers. You know, Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals were like rival brothers from the same family, from the same background. They understood each other perfectly. They had the same values, the same way of looking at the world. That's the way I see it.
What about Sunnis and Shia?
This is, you know, I think that the importance of that is exaggerated. First of all, I don't think Iran became really a Shia society until about 200 years ago. Everybody says 1501, Shah Ismail declared Shiism the state religion. First of all, in 1501, Shah Ismail had no idea about Shiism. He didn't have the slightest understanding what Shiism was. He was the leader of a group of Turkmens who worshipped Ali as a god. That's not Shiism. And for the next 200 years, because, you know, he had to import Shiite scholars from Lebanon to come and occupy posts in his government. And these scholars from Lebanon were, for the next 200 years, fighting at court with the Turkmen military officials for control of the government. This went on for 200 years. Meanwhile, the population was mostly Sunni. Okay? It wasn't till the last decade of the 1700s, the 1790s, that under very weak king, Sultan Hussein, who basically never left the harem, the Sheikh al-Islam of the Safavids, who was a fellow by the name of Muhammad Bagher Majlisi, he got an idea which was different from all the previous Shiite officials in Iran for the previous 200 years, who were just trying to impose Shia law, you know, Jafari jurisprudence they wanted to impose on society. It wasn't working. But what Muhammad Bagher Majlisi realized is that ordinary people don't understand law, theology, philosophy, these things. They don't understand these arguments. They understand rituals and popular celebrations. So he, for the first time, encouraged Shiite rituals like the Taziye, the Muharram processions, and the chest beating and these things. The Roze Khani, the reciting the stories about the martyrdom of Imam Hussein at Karbala. He encouraged these popular rituals that earlier Shiite scholars tried to suppress. They say, oh, it's popular religion, don't do that, But he realized, Majlisi realized, that's the only way people will get the religion in their hearts, because they don't understand, you could say the book version of the religion. And so it's from that time that Shiism started to, I believe, really enter Iranian society. That's only 200 years ago. That's not a long time.
But she's, I guess, asking for Yazid, for Iranian people, addressing the leader of, Sunni, for example, Yavuz Selim is Yazid.
It's political symbolism.
Yeah.
It's political symbolism.
It's also the other, in terms of...
No, it's no. I mean, yeah, I can see why you would argue that. I don't see it that way. I see it as just political symbolism and, trying to... because it had the same thing, in the Gulf War, when Morocco was sending fighters to fight against Iraq. I mean, they were shouting Arabic insults at the Iraqis, does that mean the Iraqis are the other with a capital O, I mean, no, this is a war situation. It's like, you just muster symbolism, however you can. No, I don't think that, people say, oh, Iran, they became Shiite because they're not Arab and they want to be, Iran was Sunni for most of its history, 1,200 years out of 1,400 years, they were Sunni. So, and most of the great Sunni scholars were Iranians. So,
Iraq, there are a lot of Arab Shias,
And yeah, Shiism is an Iraqi phenomenon. Shiism comes from Karbala and Najaf. It's an Arab phenomenon. It's an Arab phenomenon. It's not an Iranian phenomenon. So I would say these things are just political.
Yeah, because we have understood that if Safavis were not Shia, Ottoman Empire would took over, like Egypt and Syria. They could not resist against Ottomans, because if they were Sunnis, if they couldn't create a nation, create a differentiation from Ottomans, otherwise they would join, because they were Turks, mainly. So
I don't know. To me, it's a little bit like Putin calling the Ukrainians Nazis. I mean, it's an emotional thing. It gets people riled up. But how much truth is there behind that? I think again. Once Iran really started to become Shia, once you had Shiite scholars, Isna Ashari scholars in government positions, that wasn't what was the basis of separating the Ottomans from the, the Safavids came to power in the late 15th century because the Turkmen nomads of Eastern Anatolia didn't want to pay taxes to the Ottomans. Yeah. And the Ottomans kept sending out, armies to try to force them into submission and force them to pay taxes. And, these people, they didn't know anything about Islam. These Turkmen, they had no understanding of Islam. They were illiterate. They worshipped Ali, and they had all these, sort of Central Asian ancient shamanic rituals and traditions, which are not Islamic at all. And so the Safavids, as their spiritual guides, once they decided to become political around, 1470 or so, then they just played on that. And they played on this, distinction as a way of saying that the Ottomans are not legitimate. But once they had a state, from 1501 afterwards, I don't think that, their strength was established. The strength of the Safavid Empire was not based on Shiism, in my opinion. It was based on effective administration. That's my opinion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for your time. Can I receive questions? If any question?
Okay, so you have talked about the symbiotic relationship between Turks and Iranians actually. And like related with the Hüseyin Hoca''s second question, I understood that we don't have to affiliate this symbiotic relationship in a positive or negative way. This is one because we have talked about the yin-yang position about the symbiosis, and throughout the history we have realized that from time to time this symbiotic relationship became disadvantageous for some parts or advantageous for the other part, and these actual symbiosis have changed in history. Therefore, I would like to understand that we don't have to affiliate this kind of relationship, this symbiosis, with a positive or a negative way. It cannot be described as a, how can we say, as negative disadvantages for some parts, but advantages for the other parts. Is it wise we cannot ascribe it as a negative relationship or positive relationship?
Well, I mean, from a strictly scientific viewpoint, I don't think you can say anything in history is positive or negative because you're just looking at data. But from a human viewpoint, of course, you have feelings that this is positive, this is negative. My feeling as a human is that this symbiosis has been very positive. It's been very productive. On both of these cultures, the steppe nomadic culture and the urban literate culture, have benefited from this symbiosis. And wherever you live in the world today, from Albania to Bangladesh, you have inherited the fruit of this symbiosis. Your culture is, to a large extent, a product of this, more than 1,500 years of interaction between these two different kinds of cultures. So for me, it's a positive thing. What I'm just suspicious of and wary of and would warn against is kind of back projection, using modern frameworks and concepts to project back onto history to make exclusive claims. This is ours. No, it's ours. And, fighting over history. I don't think that that's positive. And I think, as I said at the end of our talk in Konya, my belief as a lifelong student of Iranian culture is that, and what I tell Iranians is that you cannot understand Iranian culture unless you understand Turkish culture. But I would say the same thing to Turks. You cannot understand Turkish culture unless you understand Iranian culture. The two are intertwined. Unfortunately, one of the results of nationalist thinking is that even in academia, we have these artificial boundaries that are drawn. And even when you do a PhD, at a university, you're going to be expected to study, Turkish history or Iranian history. If you want to study it as a combined thing, you might have some problems. You might not. You might find some sympathetic professors. But the way the system is set up, it channels you either into one or to the other. And I think that that's a mistake.
Serhan Hocam, you rate your contributions?
Thank you very much for this very illuminating great talk. Actually, I have more than one questions, maybe 4 or 5, but that don't, I think, add too much to our discussion. But there is one thing which somehow shocked me, your underestimation of religion, especially during the Safavid period. I couldn't disagree more on this, especially you say that Iran turned into a shared country pretty much late in Soviet history, like the end of the 18th century. This is, I think, not true, because Shah Sultan Hussein was gone in 1720 when Afghans invaded Isfahan. And
1690s, I'm sorry, did I say 1790s? I meant 1690s.
Yeah,
1690s.
In 1720 he was gone.
Yeah, okay.
And when you look at the Ottoman muftis, for example, talking about the Safavids, they clearly see them as the other. And there is no question about that.
You're talking about the Ottoman muftis.
Yes, definitely. If you look at, for example, the Husud Efendi, Cemal Paşa'da, etc., they clearly, undeniably see the Safavids as the other, as the absolute other. So what?
I should have been more specific and said that in general. I mean, you're talking about a specific case of religious figures. So, of course, you know, amongst religious rivals, these kinds of things are going to be more evident. But as a historian, I've always been very interested in looking beyond the narrative that we get from the literate elites, who I think in most times in history are a very tiny proportion of the population, 5%, 2% of the population. They're the ones that we're having discussions with because they left books for us to read. The rest of the population didn't leave us these documents so that we know what they think. Or
I don't think so. Look at Kızılbaş, for example. The Safavids, especially the followers of Shah Ismail, they call themselves Kızılbaş. And if you look at Anatolia, the term Kızılbaş does not really have very nice and fancy implications. If you call someone a Kızılbaş, that is a clearly nasty thing to say. And that is not a new construction, I think. It goes centuries back, so what would you say about that?
Again, I would say it's limited. Most Iranians were not Kızılbaş. Only a few Kızılbaş.
I'm talking about Safavids, right?
Yeah.
Because you will not accept.
I'm talking about the general population. So I guess what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to elevate our attention to the general population in contrast to the normal tendency of historians to focus on the elites of society who left written documents that are the easiest things for us to work with, but they don't represent necessarily the experience or the views of the whole society. They represent the views of the elites. So I'm not denying that this existed. So I'm not denying a sense of rivalry and otherness between the religious scholar class of the Ottomans and the Safavids. But I just want to emphasize that most people in society, whether in the Ottoman Empire or the Safavid Empire, did not belong to these elite classes of religious scholars and didn't necessarily see things in the same way.
You started with this all narrative of nationalization and nationalism, enlightenment, how this affected our perception of history, etc., etc. And this is a thesis which is pretty much common in our academia, in the world, in Turkey, and that is very much open to critique. But you seem to create an antithesis of this, which is, I think, equally problematic. There was a symbiosis between the Turks and Iranians, or the Turkic peoples and Iranian peoples, and it's not really clear how long this symbiosis lasted. I thought, for example, you would say that this symbiosis lasted at most to the 16th century, but you say it goes way beyond the 16th century, which is, I think, amazing and pretty much difficult to accept, because in the 16th century, the 17th century, and definitely in the 19th century, we do not see any clue of symbiosis between the Turks and Iranians, at least to the extent that you are trying to present, I think. So what would you say about that? Are you trying to create an antithesis common and widespread perception of the nationalist outlook to history. Is this what you are trying to do?
I don't know a lot about the Ottoman Empire and its history. I'm not going to stand by any strong claims about what the reality was in the Ottoman world. I've worked mainly on the world of the Uzbek Khanates and the Timurids of India, and to somewhat lesser extent the Safavids. So whatever I'm saying is based mainly on that. You know, I'm not sure how much any of this applies to the Ottomans. I don't have the expertise to make those claims. The strongest basis for this antithesis, as you're describing it, I would say I find in Central Asia, because again, and I will stand by that this symbiosis is very much in place right up until the 1920s, very, very clearly. Emir Alam Khan, who's the last emir of Bukhara, was forced into exile in Kabul, where he spent the last 20 years of his life and wrote his memoirs in Persian, which I've read. So that, you know, that symbiosis was very, very, very much alive. And there's still traces of it today, because in academic environment in Uzbekistan, you still see this bilingualism to a large extent. Knowing Persian is, at least in the social sciences and the humanities, it's one of the features of being an educated person, even today in Uzbekistan, even after 40 years of hostility against Persian, Tajik language. But in Iran as well, I mean, remember the Qajars were Turks, and they ruled Iran up until 1925, at least formally. Iran today is at least 25% native Turkish speakers. And if you look at the issue of identity for people who are called Azeris in Iran, it's very much a dual identity. They're very much Iranian and very much Turkish at the same time. And it's like different sides of the identity. They're clearly distinct. There's clearly a Turkish identity for Azeris, and there's clearly an Iranian identity too. They're, just as attached to the Shahnameh and to Nowruz as, native Persian speakers are. They speak Persian with perfect fluency, and so I would say on that level, I still see it in Iran. In India, of course, the Mughal period, it goes up until 1857. The Mughals were, I think, a prime example of this symbiosis. But again, in Pakistan, for example, I think you can still see elements of this today, whether it's in the activities of Sufi orders, the Naqshbandis and others, whether it's in cultural things like Qawwali music. I think these are all products. Even the Urdu language. The Urdu language is very much a product of this symbiosis that originated in the army camps, of Turkish soldiers, Persianized Turkish soldiers living in a, Indian environment, developed this language, Urdu. So yeah, these would be just some of the examples. I understand what you're saying, but I think we're focusing on, and again, I'm putting the Ottoman case aside because I just don't know enough. And the Ottomans, what I do know is that the Ottomans were the first Turkish state to promote an explicitly Turkish identity and promote the Turkish language. So in that sense, this cultural Turkification started with the Ottomans before, with the Uzbeks or, other other groups. But I think in general, what I am sensing is that your feedback is coming from a reading of textual sources for the most part. And I'm trying to look more at ethnographic evidence.
I also refer to popular culture and perceptions of ordinary people, as I said, in Greece and Anatolia. And that is, I think, not something very new. It goes all the way to the beginning of the 16th century. Yes.
But again, the Kizilbash were Turkmen. They were not ethnically Persian or Iranian.
It doesn't matter because you are talking about subjects and you say that the symbiosis was still there and something came to power. And I think one of the main questions about your presentation, about your narrative is that symbiosis is not a value-free term for you, right? I mean, you put something positive in it, and you say it, right?
Well, as I said in answer to the first question, I think that scientifically you need to stay neutral, you know, and avoid imposing a value judgment. But I'm also a human being. And so when I speak as a human being, yes, admittedly, I put a positive.
I'm not in favor of 100% objective in social science. I know that it's, I know that it's nonsense. That is not my question. But to look at history from the point of symbiosis and to put something positive in it, and to read the entire history of Turkey and Iranian people through this term, I think that is pretty much too much. Don't get me wrong, I have a lot of respect in your work. I have studied all of them, and it's a privilege to have you here, to have this discussion. I mean, don't get me wrong. But, and also, you focus on the common lineage of the Safavids and then the Turks, Qajars, they are coming from the same tribal background, etc. They are all Oghuz Turks in the first place. That the Urdu language is a mixture of Persian and Turkish, etc. But you have the same similar stories in Europe as well, right? I mean, many of these dynasties came from, the same tribes or similar tribes. They share one common linguistic background. So why are you insisting on this symbiosis when it comes to the history of Turkey?
Oh, I'm only insisting on it probably because I've spent most of my life surrounded by Iranians, and who are a very chauvinistic people. Yes. I got the sense very early on that that maybe they're the only nation on earth that are even more chauvinistic than the French. Of course, I've probably been contaminated by that chauvinism to some extent over the years. But, I mean, Iranians, when they talk about Turks today, it's usually not in a very positive way. It's not in a horrible way. It's not like Turks are enemies, but, most jokes, have a Turk as the butt of the joke. And, and it's not questioned, Nowadays in Western countries, you have to be so careful you don't insult anybody, you don't offend anybody. Iranians haven't reached that stage. They don't care about insulting or offending people. And, usually the first target are Turks. So I think when I wrote this book, Iran and World History, it was important for me to address this chauvinism, this idea that Iranians want to feel that this history all belongs to them, and I wanted to really push this idea of symbiosis, I think, as a reaction to Iranian chauvinism. That's, I think, where I'm coming from with that.
That's definitely fair enough, but from an academic point of view, I think there's a lot more to say on this symbiosis and treatment. I do respect. I mean, this is your choice, and it's my right, I think, to question that, and this is clearly what we are doing here. But to focus on the positive sides of these relations, forget about insults, forget about fights, wars, and everything, even massacres. I think that gives us only the half of the picture. But thank you very much for this discussion and for giving me the chance to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
We are closing with the last question, if it's okay for any question. No. Sure.
welcome in Istanbul.
Thank you.
It's good to see you. I touched, it was my privilege to touch your book. Actually, I am working on medieval Indian intellectual history. Yeah, there is problem in it's my complimentary remark, I may say. If I say about Dr. Serhan Hoca, who was saying about the Ottomans others was Iranians or Persians. But in terms of India, we see in the medieval time, even if we say specifically the 17th century, maybe it was the most richest economic power in the world. And even we can say in terms of culture as well. So in Indian case, it was Sunni majority Muslim empire, but there was no problem with Shia or any other groups. For example, maybe we all know here Akbar Shah or Akbar the Great. During his time, Fatullah Shirazi was one of the most medieval times famous scholar, Iranian scholar, and engineer. He was invited and he was positioned as finance minister of Akbar. So he was Iranian and Persian, Shia. Secondly, Dawani, one of the medieval scholar, maybe we can say founding scholar of medieval time. He was invited by the Indian rulers. I can say many examples like this. There was no problem with Shiaism or Shia intellectual ideas or thoughts. It didn't happen in India. Secondly, actually today's topic is Iranian and Turks. For this reason, maybe we didn't discuss more Indians. If we talk about symbiosis, maybe Indians and Persians would be more discussable issue because we see in medieval time, Shiraz, Herat, it has been said that these institutions, these cultural centers were the madrasa for the Indians. A good number of scholars, they went there and they got education and went back to India. Or Iranians got education from Herat or Shiraz and then went to India. So obviously there was some problems with the Shiaism, but it was not a matter of discussion holistically. Sometimes it happens and it was closed like that. So maybe we may think it whether there was any political fact between Ottomans or Safavids. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. A question.
Thank you for coming to Istanbul. I will add my question with my friend because I will ask about India. I will be about India for many years. And you just mentioned about Urdu that's created by Turks and Farsi language. And I wonder how, by the way, in Hindi language, there are a lot of words that came from Farsi. I wonder how we can we explain it only with political influences? That's my question. Because in India, also Turks ruled subcontinents nearly hundreds of thousands of years, and I think it's still about our topic.
Well, Hindi and Urdu were originally just the same language. It was called Hindustani most of the time. I mean, and the fact that they're separated into two languages with different alphabets and different vocabularies was the work of Indian nationalists in the second half of the 19th century. That but originally it's the same language.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. And as someone interested in environmental history, I also need to say that I like the way how you frame the history of these two nations. And my question is related to environment as well. When it comes to environmental behaviors, environmental ethics, when it comes to their attitudes towards environment in general, do you see any differences between Turkish people and Iranian people? I'm not going to ask similarity because they're very much affected by the environment, and that's why obviously they're gonna have similar attitudes to the environment. But I wonder specifically if you have any question, if you have any study on it, any differences between these two nations when it comes to environment.
Yeah, I haven't studied environmental history of either Iran or Turkey. I did do a lot of research 20-some years ago about environmental values in Islam, and I did some research in Iran on environmental NGOs. But what I can say is really not based on history, but just the world today. I would say that Iran and Turkey are two countries where environmental protection is lacking. But that's of course true for the whole world. One thing, I have a friend who's a Turkish professor specializing in environmental ethics, and he's told me some interesting things about Ottoman history, for example, that in the Ottoman Empire there were waqfs for animal hospitals, and that European travelers were amazed that the Turks would waste money on taking care of animals, you know. So I guess I'm aware of a discussion that animal rights somehow were advanced in Ottoman society. And just walking around Istanbul, I noticed there are lots of sort of crates on the street that seem to be for stray cats and dogs. I don't know if that is a legacy of this Ottoman culture of taking care of animals. I assume that it is. But I can't really answer your question, I'm sorry. It's an interesting one. I wish I knew more.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you
for all of you joining us today. And thank you for Binazir Hashimzadeh Hoca and for her team. They organized all
Thank you.
ILEM Talks. This was the 9th ILEM Talks Istanbul in person. And hopefully the next one will be also in person. Thank you so much again for your time.